All right, let's start the meeting. I'll be starting today in chapter 24 of the Old Testament prophecy of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 24. And this is actually going to be an adapted version of the message I had planned to bring last Lord's Day, but was not able to because I had to rush Mary to the hospital instead, because of which I have actually amended the opening introduction to the message. The book of Ezekiel was written at a point in time when God's wrath against Israel for their idolatry was almost at the critical boiling point of releasing a final annihilative judgment on what was left of the nation of Israel, which was basically the tribe of Judah. The book of Ezekiel was in fact written after the Babylonians' first invasion of Judah, and the first wave of captives had been taken to Babylon prior to Nebuchadnezzar's second invasion 23 years later, when he then destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and all that. Ezekiel had been brought to Babylon in that first wave of captives in 609 BC, as we read about in 2 Kings chapter 24, before Jerusalem and Solomon's temple was then finally besieged and destroyed in 586 BC in the second invasion. And so as we read there in 2 Kings 24, Ezekiel and also the prophet Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were all chosen and taken to Babylon from among the best and most able, educated of the land. A lot of the nobles and royalty were taken to Babylon in that first wave. And so as you read through the book of Ezekiel, you have to bear in mind that Ezekiel's message was primarily directed to those that were taken in that first wave of captives to Babylon. Jerusalem had not yet been destroyed. And so here in chapter 24, I want to direct us down to verse 15, where the prophet says, "Also the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, behold, I take away from thee the desire of thine eyes," meaning, by the way, Ezekiel's wife. "I take away from thee the desire of thine eyes with a stroke. Yet neither shalt thou mourn nor weep, neither shall thy tears run down." He says, "Forbear to cry, make no mourning for the dead, bind the tire of thine head upon thee," that's their turban, their headband thing they wore. "Put on thy shoes upon thy feet, cover not thy lips, eat not the bread of men." Don't display to anyone that you're in mourning. Don't show off that you're fasting, etc. Verse 18, "So I spake unto the people in the morning, and at even my wife died. And I did in the morning as I was commanded." We know from the text here that Ezekiel clearly loved his wife very much. The Lord knew that full well. And he knew that because Ezekiel's wife was the desire of his eyes, and that he did love her very much, that Ezekiel would indeed he would quite naturally cry and mourn and weep if she was taken from him. And yet, somewhat as the Lord had also commanded Aaron through Moses and his two surviving sons not to mourn or to uncover their heads or to rend their clothes, when the Lord slew Aaron's two sons Nadab and Abihu for offering strange fire on the altar, he has here also commanded Ezekiel not to mourn or weep or cry or let his tears run down. In Ezekiel's case, though, there's no indication that his wife had in any way sinned or that this stroke was some form of judgment upon her, as it was with Nadab and Abihu. In fact, it may well have been an act of mercy to relieve or protect Ezekiel's wife from suffering an even greater evil or a more painful death. As Isaiah tells us in Isaiah 57, 1-2, "The righteous perisheth, and no man layeth it to heart." In other words, unbelievers fail to understand this. The righteous perisheth, and merciful men are taken away, none considering that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come. Sometimes the Lord calls the saint of God home early to protect her from suffering a greater evil or a more painful death. And those who do not share our hope of heaven cannot understand the peace and the calm assurance we have when our when our Christian brethren, and even maybe our wife, depart from this world to be with Christ. And so there's no indication here that this sudden death of Ezekiel's wife was in any way an act of judgment upon her, but Ezekiel was still commanded not to mourn or to weep or to cry or let his tears run down. And the reason for that, as we see in the following verses, was so that Ezekiel's loss could serve as a prophetic sign to the remnant of Judah. Personally, having just lost my wife to a cancer that appeared rather suddenly last March, I have to say I'm glad the Lord didn't tell me not to mourn or to weep or let my tears run down. This has, of course, been a very emotional time for the whole family. And I can well understand how terribly difficult it would have been for Ezekiel to obey this command not to mourn or to weep at the loss of his wife. But at the same time, I can also understand that if Ezekiel knew that his wife was a born-again child of God who had therefore simply gone home to be with her Lord, then he would have been empowered and enabled by that knowledge and by that blessed assurance to obey this command. As we read in verse 18, he said, "So I spake unto the people in the morning, and at even my wife died. And I did in the morning as I was commanded. I dressed as usual, I ate as usual, and I didn't show any grief." And so now he's going to explain his absence of open grief or mourning to his fellow captives. Verse 19. "And the people said unto me, Wilt thou not tell us what these things are to us, that thou doest so?" In other words, why aren't you grieving, Ezekiel? Your wife just died. And I answered them, "The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Speak unto the house of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will profane my sanctuary, the excellency of your strength, the desire of your eyes, and that which your soul pitieth. And your sons and your daughters, whom you have left, shall fall by the sword." Those of your relatives who are still back in that land, they're going to fall by the sword. They're going to die. That being a reference, of course, to what was then the imminent and total destruction of Jerusalem and Solomon's temple that occurred again at that second Babylonian invasion in 586 BC. So with that introduction then, I want to continue today sounding a warning that I fully believe the die is cast and the stage is set for a similar annihilative judgment to fall on this land of America that fell back then on Israel and on Judah and Jerusalem. As the Lord today is no doubt just as fed up with America's wickedness as he was with that of Judah in Ezekiel's day. And as we read in Revelation 18, 5 through 6, of America, I believe, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Reward her as she has rewarded you, and double unto her, double according to her works, and the cup which she hath filled, fill to her double. Verse 8 there says, "Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord who judgeth her." So with that introduction then to this message, turn to Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6. I want to continue this message in somewhat the same way, I'll say continue the opening of this message in somewhat the same way that I opened the first message that I preached at this church back in April of 2008. About 17 and a half years ago, before I was called to pastor the church about 4 months later. Brother Slattery was still the pastor of the church at that time, and he had invited me to come up to preach a message. He wanted me to preach about the evils of church incorporation and tax exemption. And I did so. And I titled that message, "Church Incorporation and the Mark of the Beast." And that's still posted on our sermon audio site. I explained in that message why converting the body of Christ, the local church, into a tax-exempt, state-created, and state-controlled corporation actually involves the exact same idolatrous sin as in taking the mark of the beast of Revelation 13 upon the church itself. And I'm more dogmatic and resolved in that position now than I ever was. But today's message will have a more personal application to each one of us. So I want to talk today about the ongoing construction of the total surveillance system and control grid, digital control grid that Donald Trump is presiding over, which is aimed at the final implementation of that mark of the beast within the next few years. I began that message in April of 2008 with a bit of a pop quiz, or a series of questions. Jade actually is the only one here and still in the church who was there at that time. Brother Ted was there. He recently left the church. But I opened that message with a pop quiz, series of questions. The first question being directed to verse 14 of this chapter, Romans chapter 6, where Paul says, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for ye are not under the law, but under grace." Question 1, as I posed it 17 years ago now, is this: as Christians, are we still living under the Mosaic law? And of course, in general, the answer to that question is no, we are not at all still living under the Mosaic law. Question 2 I then posed was, does this verse, Romans 6:14, therefore mean that we are free to violate the moral aspects of God's law, to steal, to lie, to commit adultery or murder? And the obvious answer to that question from the New Testament as well is no. We are not at all free to violate the moral aspects of God's law. We're not free to steal, to lie, to commit murder or adultery. But I will say that there are many, many antinomian, licentious libertines of the easy-believist pseudo-Baptist persuasion, including the Heilsites and others, who live like they believe that's what this verse says. They seem to think that the definition of grace is freedom to sin at will because Jesus paid it all. He paid it all, I'm free to sin. I don't hesitate to say that those who believe that and live like that are make-believers that do not possess true salvation. But this verse does not say that, does it? It doesn't say we're free to sin. Some try to oversimplify that word grace into an acronym, saying grace simply means God's riches at Christ's expense. G-R-A-C-E. God's riches at Christ's expense. Well, it's true that at salvation we do acquire God's riches at Christ's expense, and it is God's unmerited favor. That is not the totality of the definition of grace. It means far more than that. And that word grace most definitely does not mean freedom to sin. In fact, it is quite the opposite of freedom to sin. God's grace, as that word is used in the New Testament, is instead God's divine empowerment and enablement to conquer the power that sin once held over us before we were saved. That's why Paul says here, "For sin shall not have dominion over you." While sin did once have dominion over us before we were saved, and while even after conversion the old nature and our flesh still wants to sin, while sin does still entice us and ensnares us at times and causes us to backslide, can cause us to backslide, can bring us into captivity even as Christians, and may still desire to control us, as God warned Abel back in Genesis chapter 4. Paul says here for us who are truly born again, that sin shall never again have that dominion over you. This verse, by the way, it's not an admonition or a command not to allow sin to have dominion over you. And it's also not an expression of merely what ought not to be, but instead this is Paul saying here what cannot and shall not be. This is an absolute promise that sin shall not have the dominion over believers. Paul's also not talking here about the penalty and the damning power of sin to condemn sinners to hell. He's talking about the sin's tyrannical, addictive power over our conduct. It will not rule over our conduct anymore. When we're truly saved, sin is dethroned, and the Lord Jesus is now our new Lord. By God's grace, His divine enablement, we now have power over sin through the hatred of sin that God gives us as born-again believers. Part of our new nature is to hate sin. And so that, in essence, is what Paul means here when he says, "For sin shall not have dominion over you." And then he says, "For ye are not under the law, but under grace." And so while we are not in any way free to sin, here Paul is saying that we are also not under the law as legalists or as attempting to be justified by the law as the Jews were claiming to do, to be justified by the law. All through the New Testament, and Paul's writings included, we see that we are not free to continue in sin. In fact, Paul opens this very chapter back in verse 1, saying, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Verse 2, God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? And of course, Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most important messages to the believer today, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, think not that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Jesus said, for verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. And as we've studied through parts of that discourse, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus basically laid out his standard of righteousness and holiness that he expects all of his New Testament saints to live by. We've seen there that rather than lowering the bar of the law of Moses, Jesus raised the bar to a much higher standard from observance of the letter of the law, which you can do outwardly. You can, appear to others to keep the letter of the law. But he raised the bar to the inward keeping of the spirit of the law instead. God's eternal and transcendent moral law stands forever as his standard of righteousness to declare what sin is and what it's not. God's law still condemns us and damns us to hell. And when we see that, then we run to the cross for salvation and cleansing from sin in the power of the blood of the Lamb. And that's what Paul meant, exactly what Paul meant when he said in Galatians 3:24, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. That condemns us of our sin and leads us to the cross. And so then the answer to question 2 is no. We are not at all free to violate the moral aspects of God's law. And after driving that point home far more than I did back in 2008, question 3 I then asked at that time was, are there any sins that we can commit that are not identified as sin in God's law? Repeat that question. I asked, are there any sins that we can commit that are not identified as sin in God's law? The answer to that question is found in a few places. First of all, 1 John 3:4, we find the definition of sin. John says, whoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law. He said, for sin is the transgression of the law. That's the definition of sin. We also read at Romans 4, verse 15, Paul says, because the law worketh wrath, he said, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Where no law is, there is no transgression. Conversely, he said in Romans 5:13, that sin is not imputed when there is no law. Of course, the Lord also says in Deuteronomy 4:2, you shall not add to the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish aught from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. God does not intend that we should add our own list of sins to the ones he has already identified. That's what the Pharisees did. Of course, that's why Jesus so strongly condemned the Pharisees, because they both added to and took away from God's law. And so putting these verses together, 1 John 3:4, Romans 4:15, 5:13, we know that sin is defined as transgression of the law. Sin is not imputed when there is no law. Where no law is, there is no transgression. And therefore we can dogmatically conclude that there are no sins we can commit that are not identified and spelled out in God's law. So having said that now, I've given that lesson, please turn to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation 13. I'll wait for you to get there. Revelation 13. Start in verse 16 and 17 here. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom, let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. These verses are found at the end of a chapter in which two entities rise to power that John calls beasts. As with Daniel's prophecies in Daniel chapter 7, these two beasts symbolize two separate world empires, one of which we see here. The first one is political and military. The second is religious. The first beast we see in verses 1 through 10. I'll just read the first two verses. John says, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon, that's the devil himself, gave him his power and his seat and great authority. The imagery here of this beast, part leopard, part bear, and part lion, shows this beast to be one and the same beast or global empire as the fourth empire beast of Daniel chapter 7. What we see in that chapter is actually a conglomeration or a merger of the 3 empires that went before it. We've been all through this many times. The first beast, the Babylonian Empire, pictured there as a lion. Second, Medo-Persia, pictured there as a bear. And thirdly, the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, pictured there as a leopard. We also see there in Daniel 7 that the fourth empire, which is that of Rome, remains, or it is in fact revived so as to be in existence when Christ sets up his kingdom on this earth. And this therefore, as confirmed by the 10 horns on that beast and this one and the same as this first beast John describes in this chapter. Like unto a leopard, his feet were as the feet of a bear, mouth was the mouth of a lion. Which then takes in and encompasses all those empires that went before it. And so back here to verse 11, John sees this second beast come up. And I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. He exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. He doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven and on the earth in sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image of the beast which had the wound by the sword and did live. Verse 15, he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Then verse 16, and he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. And so we see here 2 beastly empires that work in concert together, while the first beast in this chapter represents this global military political empire. The second beast here, having 2 horns like a lamb, but speaking as a dragon, represents a global religious empire. Just as we see today the American empire working hand in glove with the Vatican in building what is in fact the most unholy revived Roman Empire. As pointed out before, it is in fact the second beast of this chapter that has a major role in deceiving the world to accept this mark. And just like they were lining deceived sheeple up at the apostate churches to get their COVID vaccine, so they will do in the near future with this final mark of the beast. But then turn over to the next chapter, chapter 14, Revelation 14. We're reading verse 9. The third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast in his image, receive his mark in their forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture, is not diluted, into the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels, and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast in his image. And whosoever receiveth in the mark of his name. Verse 12, here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Those who don't take the mark, in other words. This last verse here being very important, that word patience here, meaning, again, as it usually means in the New Testament, the willing endurance of tribulation, suffering, and possible martyrdom in favor of instead keeping the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus rather than compromise. And so, as for the commandments of God that they do keep. Again, as covered already, God's law is eternal, doesn't change. There are no sins that are not identified in the law. Contrary to the satanic teachings of the rabid heretic C.I. Scofield, the gospel does not change. The everlasting gospel preached in verse 6 of this chapter is not a new gospel. Revelation 12:11, by the way, says God's people still overcome by the blood of the Lamb. And yet this verse still keeps the faith of Jesus. And by the way, they're still on the earth. They haven't been raptured out. So the gospel has not changed. That, therefore, brings me now to question number 4 that I asked back in 2008. You can't sin without breaking God's law. What is the great sin in taking the mark of the beast? What is so terribly evil about taking the mark of the beast that those who do so are punished in this way? Sin is defined as transgression of the law. So which of God's laws does taking the mark of the beast violate? Which of God's laws does taking the mark of the beast violate? The purpose for this message today, just as it was back in April 2008, is to help us all to see that taking the mark of the beast personally and individually violates the exact same law that is violated when the church is converted into a tax-exempt corporation. Both such acts are a violation of the first and most primary of all God's laws, the first one of the 10 Commandments that God wrote with his own finger in Moses' tablets of stone, where he said, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Taking the mark of the beast will, at the time it is implemented, be an acknowledgement that Caesar is your supreme Lord and Master, that you'll give him unconditional reverence to and obedience to. It is the unconscionable sin of putting the civil government or the state in the place of preeminence and supreme lordship that only Jesus should occupy as sovereign and Lord, and therefore as your God. Only God deserves unconditional obedience. To take the mark of the beast during the tribulation period, to surrender to the civil government as your Lord and Master, is just as heinous a sin now as it will be during the tribulation period. That time of tribulation is not a new dispensation, as the rapturists seem to think. Christ's saints are not removed from the earth before that time, and it should be plain as day from just the reading of verse 12 here that I just quoted. And furthermore, God's law does not change during that time of tribulation. And allowing the civil government or the state to be your provider, your supreme ruler, is a direct violation of the first of God's laws engraven in stone, that thou shalt have no other gods before me. I would submit that just taking that mark, whatever it is, in whatever final form it takes, whether it's an implantable biochip or whatever it is, the Bible says it will be in your hand or in your forehead. But taking that will in itself be an act of subservient and idolatrous worship. And today, the powers that be, the so-called movers and shakers in this world who serve their father the devil, are working tirelessly and in concert in the shadows to build the total control, AI-empowered digital surveillance and monetary system that will enable a final world dictator to demand that form of unconditional submission to his supreme lordship. To be able to monitor each and every commercial transaction on the planet, to control how every individual person spends his money in real time, and to therewith demand that every person on earth submit to his system of rule in order to buy and sell and function in commerce. And that is precisely why the two-faced, double-tongued deceiver Donald Trump posted the following tweet to his Elon Muskrat revived X account last month on June 18th. Trump said the Senate just passed an incredible bill that's going to make America the undisputed leader in digital assets. Nobody will do it better. It is pure genius, says Trump. Digital assets are the future, and our nation is going to own it. We are talking about massive investment, big innovation. The House will hopefully move lightning fast and pass a clean Genius Act. Get it on my desk ASAP. No delays, no add-ons. This is what Trump wrote. This is American brilliance at its best. We are going to show the world how to win with digital assets like never before. That is the sales pitch for the mark of the beast. That's the sales pitch we're getting for the mark of the beast. Out of the horse's mouth. According to Wikipedia, the guiding and establishing national innovation for U.S. stablecoins, aka the Genius Act. Again, it's the guiding and establishing national innovation for U.S. stablecoins, Genius Act. Wikipedia defines that as the United States federal law that aims to create a comprehensive regulatory framework for stablecoins. It says stablecoins are a type of cryptocurrency that are backed by reliable assets such as national currency or commodities such as gold. The act requires stablecoins to be backed one for one by U.S. dollars or low-risk assets, as if dollars are any form of stable backing. It says this establishes a stringent standard for purposes of determining reserves during audits and providing transparency for buyers. Prior to passage of the Genius Act, stablecoins were not required to maintain a one-to-one backing with a low-risk asset. By the way, the dollar is not a low-risk asset, but anyway, they say it is. This act serves as a first step in establishing dual federal and state supervision and consumer protection. Dual federal and state supervision and consumer protection. Supervision over what you buy and sell is what it is. That's what Wikipedia says, but what Wikipedia is not telling you is that this bill actually enables creation of a central bank digital currency, was something that Donald Trump promised during his campaign he would not allow. Again, in this aforementioned sales pitch for the mark of the beast, his aforementioned tweet, Trump said, the House will hopefully move lightning fast and pass a clean Genius Act. Get it on my desk ASAP. No delays, no add-ons. This is American brilliance at its best. We're going to show the world how to win with digital assets like never before. And this, he now says, after making the following campaign promise during a campaign event in January of last year, he said, quote, I will never allow the creation of a central bank digital currency. Such a currency would give the federal government absolute control of your money, Trump said, which would be a dangerous threat to freedom, Trump acknowledged. That's how he got elected, on that promise, among others, ending the war in Ukraine on day one, etc. However, just like all of his other campaign promises, the liar, flipper, Donald Trump, flipped on this one too, because this bill will definitely allow and foster the private creation of a central bank digital currency. On July 17th, the House did pass the bill, which was then signed into law the next day. As ordered by Mr. Trump, Speaker Mike Johnson, another fake Baptist Jesuit shill, would not allow any amendments to this bill banning CBDCs as was attempted. During the vote, House Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the few representatives who speak the truth these days, posted this tweet to X stating this, I just voted no on the rule for the Genius Act because it does not include a ban on central bank digital currency and because Speaker Johnson did not allow us to submit amendments to the Genius Act. She said Americans do not want a government-controlled central bank digital currency. So the day after the bill passed the House, no amendments, surrounded by his loyal entourage of fawning legislators, Johnson included, the two-faced, double-tongued deceiver Donald Trump signed that bill while saying, I also remain fully committed to my pledge never to allow the creation of a central bank digital currency in America. According to one article, the Genius Act in effect creates a digital dollar known as a stablecoin, which will eventually replace all cash and will enable governments to freeze the accounts of anyone declared in violation of lawful federal or state executive branch regulations, such as the vaccine mandates passed down in 2021 by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Genius Act also allows digital accounts to be frozen for alleged violation of state regulations issued by state governors. The article states as follows. The digital credits, which is essentially what they are, created by Trump's and the big bank's Genius Act, are called stable coins. They are so named because they are backed by the U.S. dollar, which in turn is backed by nothing. The editor-in-chief of Bitcoin magazine, Mark Goodwin, says stable coins are actually CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. Except instead of being directly issued by the central bank, the Federal Reserve, they are issued by the largest of private corporations according to the rules of the central bank. In other words, there is no difference as it affects the average person on the street. Trump's stablecoins are essentially the CBDCs he promised to ban and did in fact ban in a smoke and mirror executive order in February 2025. By the way, Palantir is probably one of the corporations that will be issuing these things. Goodwin then goes on to say stablecoins are the bait and switch for direct issued government CBDCs. They can be programmed exactly like how we fear CBDCs will be programmed. They're exactly the same tokenized mechanism. They can be taken out of your wallet. Your wallet can be blacklisted. A lot of things that we fear about CBDCs are totally available within the tool set of stablecoins. In other words, the Genius Act is the next step being taken by the federal fraudsters to gain total control over how every citizen is allowed to conduct transactions in commerce. And Trump said, get this on my desk, I want to sign it, don't change anything. And may I say, this is just one of many steps that Donald J. Trump has been taking with blinding speed since he took office to close the gap on the electronic prison, digitized control grid he's trying to force every citizen into. While his ever faithful cheerleaders at Fox News, the Fox and the Hen House, are constantly keeping the duped, brainwashed, and still faithful MAGA support base distracted with the Epstein files, Joe Biden's mental decline, with stupid Kamala Harris's political ambitions, new allegations of the Russia collusion scandal being concocted by Obama himself. They'll do anything they can to keep dumbed down pseudo-Christians distracted so they don't see any of this. None of what I'm saying today will ever be reported on Fox News. In my message last July 5th on spiritual wickedness in high places, I mentioned how Trump is helping Netanyahu build a zero-cash total economic surveillance system for Gaza as a preliminary testing ground for a full global rollout of the mark of the beast. But now we find he's been doing the exact same thing here, which no doubt started on day one of his second term when he announced the launch of the massive Stargate AI data center project, then using Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem to aggressively push for all states to require the Real ID system, already in use here in Florida, by the way, which can in the future be used to link all bank accounts, medical records, and all other data on every citizen together. As of the first of last month, it was announced that Trump has now given Palantir, Peter Thiel's company, the contract to tie all data on all Americans together into one master database. Palantir, again, as the Silicon Valley high-tech AI surveillance corporate giant founded by a mega-billionaire Peter Thiel that feeds intel to every Western regime from the CIA to the MI6. It was also the company that generates and supplies AI kill lists for the Israeli genocide operation in Gaza. Peter Thiel funded Clearview AI's facial recognition nightmare. And again, he's described as the so-called kingmaker who backed J.D. Vance and put him in the Senate. By the way, it was also announced last Thursday that Palantir, Peter Thiel's corporation, was just awarded a $10 billion Army contract, one of the biggest in DoD history. Palantir's software runs through 30 plus federal agencies. Its stock value has basically tripled since Trump took office, and its market cap now tops Bank of America and Coca-Cola. And now, as part of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, it was also just signed into law recently. By the way, as soon as I heard Trump call this thing this Big Beautiful Bill, I knew it was just another Trojan horse, as most acts of Congress have been for decades. This so-called Big Beautiful Bill being another Trojan horse loaded with control grid mandates. Among other things, it includes a provision which attempts to ban states from passing safety regulations governing artificial intelligence, also known, of course, as AI. And it also attempts to prevent enforcement of AI laws that states have already passed. And this will definitely impact what Palantir, a private corporation, by the way, can or cannot do with this so-called master data file it's going to be compiling on every citizen, such as how it can run facial recognition software, which records and tracks every individual's movement everywhere you go. This is all being done without a warrant It's all in violation, direct violation of the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Newsweek reported on Trump's big beautiful bill, its provision to ban laws governing AI, stating as follows: the bill calls for the end to all state AI regulations, bans states from enforcing existing regulations, reading, quote, no state or political subdivision thereof may enforce any law or regulation regulating artificial intelligence models, artificial intelligence systems, or automated decision systems during the 10-year period beginning on the date of the enactment of this act. So they're going to have everything done within 10 years. So they're basically trying to do away with any state control over what the federal government's doing. And then, as if this isn't enough, what else has Mr. Trump been up to? There's much more, I can say, that Trump has been up to. I mentioned Catherine Austin Fitts in the message last June 1st about Trump's strong delusion. She is, again, Catherine Austin Fitts. She's a highly informed former investment banker and former public official who served as managing director of the very prestigious investment firm of Dillon and Reed. Before she then served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development for housing during the presidency of George Bush Sr. back in 1988 to 92, in which position she and a coworker, again, discovered a program that began back in the 1990s to move trillions of dollars, federal tax dollars, off budget so they could fund top secret black ops projects, both in space and underground, not only to wage war from space-based weaponry, but also to survive, to enable the elite to survive what she referred to as what they see as a coming so-called near extinction event. And she publishes in her Solari report and also on her website solari.com, SOLARI.com. She has an amazing amount of information on that website exposing the dark agenda of the elite. It includes a constantly updated list of actions that Trump has taken to date to build the so-called, quote, fast approaching digital control grid. And it also includes what Trump has not done, by the way, and should do to stop it, but he's not going to do. That web page includes over 60 entries with over 80 links to various sources documenting Trump's aggressive efforts to build a global prison camp, basically, to implement the mark of the beast. That list at present is topped by an entry on July 8th about the Genius Act, which, among other points, quotes Armstrong Economics publication stating, I quote, essentially the government is turning the stablecoin into a digital dollar of sorts. The concern here is that this could delve into digitizing all currency and creating a CBDC. The act specifically provides the government with the authority to block, freeze, and reject specific or impermissible transactions. In other words, it gives the federal government powers to control your bank account and how you use it. Quote, continuing with the quote, this provision is not intended to protect the world against drug smugglers and thieves. This provision is intended to grant government unlimited control over how people spend stable coins. End quote. Catherine Austin Fitts' webpage there includes a section called The War on Cash. Includes the following entries Trump has done. He's directed the U.S. Treasury to stop minting pennies, of course. Nickels are next to be on the list to be terminated. Doing away with cash. Tracking cash tips. According to USA Today on May 17th, the bill proposed by House Republicans would create a temporary tax deduction through 2028 for employees and independent contractors and occupations that traditionally and customarily receive tips, likely servers, for example. This appears to be part of the push to track cash flows and eventually supplant cash tips with digital QR codes, something already being widely encouraged by hotels. So what they actually want to do is control tips. They're not trying to free it up. Another thing that Trump's done is Social Security goes 100% paperless. This was added July 21st. Over 73 million Americans, retired and disabled workers, survivors of deceased workers, receive Social Security payments, most of which are made electronically. In March 2025, President Trump mandated the elimination of payment by check, forcing 520,000 people to choose either direct deposit or a prepaid debit card payment, forcing them to do away with checks. According to the Senior Citizens League, the transition to electronic Social Security payments could pose significant challenges for unbanked individuals, those without internet access, or those who are not computer literate. As for the One Big Beautiful Bill, this is a section she added on July 21st. The BBB, Big Beautiful Bill, passed amidst carping from every conceivable corner of the political spectrum. A few spotted or cared about. The Trojan horse that just snuck in with a ginormous payload for technocracy, AI, and biometric surveillance. This is on par with the Patriot Act. Palantir and the facial recognition database, we talked about that. Stargate, LLC. The Stargate initiative involves building out of data centers sufficient to support a complete control grid and an all-digital monetary system. This is why he wants this Stargate system built. Social credit systems they're building just like China has. That's just a few of items on this list that Catherine Austin Fitts has put together. The list goes on and on ad infinitum. I may post a copy of that list to a sermon audio page for this message. But this only touches on what Trump is doing here. I mean, actually, it's a lot, is it not? It touches on what Trump is doing here at home to do away with cash and to build a digital control grid economic prison for us all. Every day that goes by brings more and more evidence that Donald Trump is doing all that he can to accelerate and finally accomplish the full implementation of the very mark of the beast that we just read about. And when we factor in what Trump is doing to extend the war in Ukraine, and we now hear what he is also doing to use the NATO alliance in a war that is being planned for 2027 against both Russia and China. I think at a minimum it's safe to say that Donald Trump never had any intention of making America great again. On Friday, by the way, in response to some statements made by Vladimir Putin's second in command, Donald Trump stated as follows. Based on the highly provocative statements, this is Trump talking, former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, I have ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions, just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that. Words are very important and can often lead to unintended consequences. I hope this will not be one of those instances. Thank you for your attention to this matter. America has shifted, by the way, from conventional armaments, conventional warfare, to nuclear. I mean, we can't supply Ukraine with enough armaments to win this war. They're just depleting the conventional warfare armaments that they have. They've converted basically over to a nuclear position. So when we also factor in what Trump is doing to portray himself as Israel's redeemer and hero, to continue enabling and blessing the extermination of the people of Gaza, to make it the Riviera of the East, along with his famously fierce countenance profile pic, his boastful lying tongue, his magnifying himself in his heart, being a vile person of highly immoral character, as having been denied the honor of the kingdom for a time, as Daniel prophesied of that man of sin that would come on the scene, is certainly looking more and more every day like Donald Trump is in fact that very man of sin known as the Antichrist. So on that note, let's turn back to Revelation chapter 14, please. As for the war being planned for 2027, I mentioned earlier, I heard this plan again, I mentioned recently, on what I consider to be one of the best, if not the best, Intel update channels on YouTube. That being the Duran channel with Alexander Mercouris and Alex Cristoforo. They had a program a week or so ago about Trump and German Chancellor Merz colluding on a dangerous escalation against Russia, with Germany now planning to send long-range Taurus missiles to Zelensky in Ukraine to hit Moscow with. The storyline they're putting out is that the missiles are being made in Ukraine, but apparently everyone knows that's a lie. They're being made in Germany and shipped to Zelensky. And this, of course, comes as the entire front line of the war there in Ukraine has collapsed. Ukrainian soldiers are giving up in despair, and Russia is advancing rather quickly now toward Kiev. And they're also moving more Oreshnik missiles into Belarus as well. And this is taking place when neither Germany nor the U.S. can send Zelensky enough missiles to make any difference whatsoever or change things on the battlefield. They made the point on that program that the European leaders are pushing Trump for war with Russia. They apparently want war with Russia. Of course, they want America to lead the way, but they want war with Russia for some reason. And they said that Merz, being the most hawkish and outspoken of all of them, the European leaders, they said being absolutely committed to striking Russia, and Merz having stated openly that he wants to take Germany into a conflict with Russia, and that he's not afraid of such a conflict. Well, he certainly should be, unless they know something that we don't know. But they said on the program, even NATO commanders are saying that 2027 is the date that they're projecting for this war to break out, not only with Russia, but also with China. And when I heard that, I immediately thought of what one of our church members heard from her brother-in-law, who is an officer in the Air Force. He dropped out for a time, but he's now re-enlisted, and he's been deployed now to Jordan, who saw some of his fellow airmen wearing badges with the date 2027 displayed on the badge. This happened about a year ago. He asked them why they were wearing them, and they said they were in preparation for World War III. And he also said that their information was based in part on intel intercepted from the Chinese government, among other sources. My guess instead, however, is that this plan was actually hatched and conveyed from the Vatican to the White House. There's much more detail I could go into today on all these issues relative to Trump's accelerating the mark of the beast in World War III. I'll probably go into that next week. But for now, I just want to refer us back to the text we already saw here in Revelation 14, where we read in verse 9, "And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture, without dilution, without mercy, wrath without mercy, into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name." Verse 12, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." That being, of course, those who stand against that mark and will not take it. Again, that word patience here in verse 12 means the willing endurance of tribulation, suffering, and possible martyrdom. Determining to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus in the face of martyrdom and suffering, rather than to compromise or submit to evil. As Revelation 12:11 also says, that during that time, those saints of God that are obviously still on the earth will overcome Satan, the devil, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and that they love not their lives unto the death. And this is where the saying of the Lord Jesus in Matthew 16:25 applies directly, where he said, "Whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it." That statement becomes ever more crucial in reference to the mark of the beast. Those that take that mark in effort to save their lives on this earth will in fact be acknowledging that the Antichrist is in fact their supreme Lord, just as the churches today have made the IRS their Lord, for which all who take that mark will reveal themselves to be unbelievers or make-believers, fake believers. The early Christians were arrested and carted off to the Colosseum in Rome to be fed to the lions because they refused to merely voice the words, "Caesar is Lord." But we read in Acts 17:7, it was said of the early Christians that these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. And that has to be our position also. We must have no king but King Jesus, and we cannot bow down to the dictates of the state that are contrary to God's word. I'm going to end the message on that note for today, but because we've covered a lot of ground, I'm going to open the floor for some questions and discussion, any comments you guys want to make, anything you think I missed, etc.